Greetings. What I wanted to do with this presentation was to put the readings for this week in their appropriate context, specifically Washington and Du Bois. I think that this may be helpful in terms of understanding where they're coming from. So let's start with the time. This is the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. This is a point in history where a lot of the gains that have occurred directly after the end of the Civil War for African Americans, uh, African Americans being elected to local and state, as well as national political offices, because African American men have been given the right to vote. There's been a shift in literacy in the African American community from the low single digits immediately after enslavement to very high double digits by the end of the 19th century. There's also been a fundamental shift in terms of the political dynamics of the South, in terms of the momentum, the political momentum. Subsequent to the end of the Civil War, you have African Americans moving with great intensity towards the acquisition of schooling, the acquisition of education, because it is believed that education was the most effective means via which they could safeguard their liberty, safeguard their freedom. And the parallel thrust of this was the significant investment of African American energy in terms of political offices, electing officials, because they felt that now that they had a voice in the political process, they needed to move quite deliberately, quite intensely to ensure that they could shape policy. And shape it they did. The public school systems of the South were created as a direct consequence of the political engagement of African Americans. But whereas on one hand there have been these many gains, by the time you get to about the 1880s and going into the 1890s, these gains are starting to reverse themselves. With Union troops being pulled out of the South by the national government, by the federal government, a system of terrorism is basically reigned on African American communities. And so the right to vote is being suppressed increasingly, um, as well as even the range of possibilities in terms of education, which I'll come back to later on. And so by the time you get to the end of the century, uh, we're talking about an African American community that in many ways is very much under siege because their right to vote has been curtailed. Their ability to exercise their right to vote has been curtailed through naked terrorism as well as through a number of discriminatory acts like poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and the like, as well as and so anyway. Um, what's happened then, and in fact, just 3 years before Washington's essay, you have the Plessy versus Ferguson decision from the United States Supreme Court. And this decision has significant implications in terms of sanctioning the system of state-sponsored racial subordination. Basically, Plessy versus Ferguson argues that discrimination in accommodations is acceptable. Discrimination in commercial contexts is acceptable. State governments or local governments take this idea and run with it. Also, I conclude that any level of discrimination within the public sphere is acceptable so long as adequate accommodations are made to the party that has been the victim of this discrimination. And so you have the emergence out of the Plessy versus Ferguson case, the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, this idea of separate but equal. What we know and what we discover as we look at this period well into the 20th century is that separate is hardly ever equal. So it's a very difficult time. One of the issues that's happening pertaining to education is not only do you have African Americans who are attempting to use education as a means of ensuring their liberty, but you also have other interests who are interested in using education as a means of subordinating African Americans at a particular point in a particular strata in society. By strata, I mean rank. You know, so if we talk about a class strata, a working class strata, at the end of the 19th century, you would have high skilled, high paid laborers. You'd have semi-skilled, medium-paid laborers. You would have unskilled, low-paid laborers. And there was a concerted interest among many white supremacists and white supremacists or racists in the South to create an educational system that would train African American workers only insofar as it would allow them to occupy the bottom rungs of this wage labor hierarchy. You also had this idea coming from the North, from philanthropists, people like J.P. Morgan and the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and so on, because these industrialists were some of the key shapers of African American education after the Civil War. Not just African American education, but education throughout the country. And they were not necessarily interested in African American empowerment, but what they were interested in was social stability. And this advocacy of social stability would compel them to embrace this system, embrace this idea that we were transitioning from a system of enslavement to a wage labor system, and that the appropriate place for African Americans within that system is the space at the bottom of the society, because this would diminish volatility between the masses of African Americans and the masses of whites in the South. So this is a little bit about the context. Let's talk about Booker T. Washington. So Booker T. Washington is born in enslavement. So he's born an enslaved African American. After enslavement, he, just like many other African Americans, sought out education. He ended up going to school at Hampton Institute, which was founded by Samuel Chapman Armstrong, who was an avowed white supremacist. Samuel Chapman Armstrong believed that African Americans were innately inferior to white people. Samuel Chapman Armstrong was also invested in this idea of ensuring that African Americans occupied the bottom of the society. And so his curriculum was devised to ensure that kind of outcome. So Booker T. Washington goes to this school. He's turned on by this idea of what they called at the time industrial education, what in the 20th century we would simply call vocational education. What attracts Washington to this idea is not necessarily this belief that African Americans are inferior to whites innately. Clearly, when you read the text, Washington does not advocate this idea that there's an innate inferiority or an innate superiority in anyone for that matter. What Washington is concerned about is the pragmatism of African Americans moving from a subordinate position to a position of equality. He concludes that it's not practical for African Americans to achieve social equality through exercising their political rights, through voting. And this was an astute analysis, given the amount of terrorism, the amount of coercion that was being brought to bear against African American communities to suppress their resolve to vote. Washington takes the position that economic power is another route to political power. So instead of taking the direct route from political power, by putting pressure directly on the political system, by voting, by running candidates, by pressuring candidates, and so forth, Washington says that economic power engenders political power. Economic power creates political power. And he begins to advocate this idea of African Americans going to school, acquiring practical skills that would allow them to gain a viable economic foothold, and using their knowledge, applying their knowledge in the interest of economic development in African American communities throughout the South. Washington was advocating what we would call an instrumental view of schooling, that is, education for the acquisition of very specific, in this case, very specific material needs, skills. So, whereas in the text you see that he, doesn't necessarily object to people studying things like history or philosophy or science, Washington's question is always, how does this apply to solving the real challenges faced by African American communities in the South? He argued that there was a cultural disconnect between the educators who were coming largely from the northeastern United States, many from New England, and the physical needs of African American communities for technical skills that would enable them to change their condition. And this is critically important because one would ask, well, why wouldn't people who've been enslaved for centuries come out having technical skills? But the process of enslavement didn't necessarily thrive on distributing technical skills to large sections of the African American community. To a large extent, that system was viable in the sense that it allowed most people who were captives of it to be redundant. When someone is redundant, that means you can take them out, you can put somebody else in. And so within a system of enslavement, most laborers were redundant. So you take this one person who's picking tobacco and you put another person in that place. You take this one person who's picking cotton and you put another person in that place. There was not an interest in creating this highly specialized, high-skilled labor. Interestingly, what happens after the end of enslavement is that many African Americans, lacking the skill to do anything else, end up continuing their work, continuing their residency on the plantations that they inhabited as enslaved persons, but this time as sharecroppers, which means they have to pay rent to their slave master, whereas they didn't pay rent before. They have to pay for food and clothing and so on to their former slave master, which they didn't have to do before. But now in the sharecropping system, they have to. They have production quotas they have to meet. Oftentimes, they wouldn't meet those production quotas because the production quotas would be unrealistically high because they would be set by the landowners, the former slave owners, and oftentimes would find themselves in debtors' prisons. Washington's looking at this and he's saying, well, look, obviously political equality matters, but if you have a system where people lack skills and because of their lack of skills are entrapped, ensnared in an oppressive economic relationship with their former slave owners, then clearly we have to deal with that oppressive economic relationship so that African Americans can decouple themselves from their slave owners so they can create their own viable economic enterprises and via that path achieve political power down the road. So that was Washington's perspective in a nutshell. So when he leaves Hampton, he goes to the deep South. He goes to Alabama. He starts Tuskegee Institute with the goal of spreading this model, of spreading this idea far and wide of vocational education or industrial education in the language of the day for African Americans. Again, emphasizing that whatever African Americans are learning in school, that knowledge should have direct applications to the marketplace, direct applications into economic development or economic capacity in the community. And by the end of the 19th century, Washington becomes the most influential African American in the country because many of those same industrialists that I mentioned earlier are intrigued by this idea, intrigued by this model, and intrigued by Washington's charisma. So that's Washington. Let's talk about Du Bois. So Du Bois is born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. He was born free in New England. And Du Bois receives a liberal education. He goes to Fisk University for his undergrad. This is actually his first significant experience in a traditional African American community, and specifically an African American community in the South. After Fisk, he goes to Harvard. He takes a short break from Harvard and goes to Germany to the University of Berlin. He comes back from the University of Berlin and finishes his studies at Harvard, teaches for a few years in Ohio, and then ends up at what is today Clark Atlanta University in Atlanta, Georgia. Du Bois has a different view of education from Washington, and there's a couple of experiences that have shaped that. One is his work with the group called the Niagara Movement. The Niagara Movement was what would be called a militant African American activist organization at the end of the 19th century. The Niagara Movement had teachers, activists, writers, and so on, all who were advocating for African American equality, who were advocating for civil rights for African Americans, who felt that the system of state-sponsored racial subordination, which we call segregation, was not only an affront to the humanity of African Americans, but that it was a betrayal of the ethos and the principles of democracy. So that experience shaped Du Bois. He was not interested in this idea that economic interest precedes political interest. Economic empowerment precedes political empowerment. He felt that no political empowerment must come first, that it is intolerable to expect African Americans to live within the context of the indignity of an oppressive system. The other experience that shaped Du Bois' thinking, in addition to his work with the Niagara Movement, was his own beliefs and his own knowledge about the significance of education for African American communities. At the end of the 19th century, he does a study called the college-bred Negro. What he does is that him and his research team are able to locate all the African Americans who at this point had graduated with college degrees. Again, we're talking about, 3 decades, a little over 3 decades after enslavement. And he identifies these folks, what their degrees were in, and what kind of work they were doing in the community. And what he found invariably was that educated African Americans, wherever they were in the country, had taken their knowledge and they had begun the process of putting that knowledge to work to address the significant challenges that were being faced by people in their community. And so they made themselves the servants of the community in a lot of ways, but also positioned themselves as the leaders of the community simultaneously. Du Bois looks at this and he says, well, education has intrinsic value. Education actually deepens our humanity, that it gives us, that it deepens our perspective about the world, giving us the ability to think critically and analytically about the problems that we're faced with, but it also gives us a greater breadth of perspective, which means it allows us to see the world from a global view, from a view beyond our own local subjectivity. He once said, in commenting upon the emergence of educational institutions for African Americans in the South in the late 19th century, that we're talking about a people who was not simply ignorant of letters, but were ignorant of life itself. And so he argued that education is a means by which we acquire the capacity to live fully in the world. So for him, education was not something that we got simply to acquire skills that we can then leverage in the marketplace. Education was something that we sought out so that we could gain a deeper understanding of how to live and how to live more fully in the world, which is a very different view from Washington. So Du Bois had what we can refer to as an intrinsic view of education, meaning this idea that education had intrinsic value because it deepened our humanity and gave us a fuller sense of the world and our place within it and our capacity to shape it in dynamic ways. So that's Du Bois. And Du Bois, of course, becomes, within the first decade of the 20th century, Washington's leading opponent. And this debate between these two men goes on for the next decade or so, and tapers off quite significantly in the 19-teens, the 1920s. Washington's death had something to do with it, but also by the time you get to the 1930s, in higher education, you see that the vocational model of schooling that Washington is advocating and the liberal arts model, because that's really what Du Bois is advocating, what we call liberal arts education. Those models coalesce in higher education around the 1930s. So we no longer see this dichotomy, this separation of these two types of ideas by the 1930s. But also, the debate loses its momentum because despite the fervor of each of these men's perspectives, ultimately neither of them had the power to fundamentally reshape African American education along the lines of their interests. And by that, I mean this. I mentioned that Washington, by the end of the 19th century, was the most influential African American in the country. Now, that he was influential doesn't necessarily mean that he was powerful in a comparable sense. He did have some power. He had a lot of power. He could, there were many African Americans whose careers he ruined because they opposed him and his views. But if he were, all of a sudden, in say 1901, decided that he was no longer interested in this model of industrial education, and he called up the white industrialist philanthropist in the North and said, "Hey, I'm turning course, and we're going to switch to liberal arts, at Tuskegee and all of the other institutions that are responsive to my views." It's quite likely that he would have gone in very short order from being the most influential African American in the country to being one of the least influential, because the economic strings that between him and those very powerful men who were shaping the country would have been cut to very disastrous consequences. And so Washington, though he did have some measure of power, ultimately the direction of African American education wasn't being decided in Tuskegee, Alabama. It was being decided in New England. It was being decided by people like Rockefeller and Carnegie and Morgan. And this is critically important. So despite all of the brilliance of Du Bois's incisive, critique of Washington, he also didn't necessarily have the power to shape this debate. This debate was being shaped by interests much more powerful, much more influential than either of these two men. And so I think it's always important just to note that a great book, if any of you are interested, that talks about this is called The White Architects of Black Education by William Watkins. And he actually goes through the whole history of these white industrialists and philanthropists and their hand in shaping African American education. So that's the nature of that conflict and kind of where it goes in the end. One thing I think that is important to keep in mind is that although we're talking about a debate from the turn of the century about African American education and the implications of African American education for the future, their debate had an enormous amount of relevance for the present. Because we are today, some would argue, situated with these two dichotomies, this idea of education having instrumental value and this idea of education having intrinsic value. When we think about instrumentalism in education, a lot of people look at the standards movement, the emphasis on standardized curricula and standardized tests as an example of instrumentalism, or the idea that of continued vocationalism in school. Some people would say that the argument that all students should come out of school career ready, or even the way higher education actually has increasingly been reshaped around certifications, around preparing people for professional fields, whether it's business, whether it's nursing, what have you. Some people would argue that that all speaks to this idea of an instrumental model of schooling, and not necessarily that that's a bad thing, but that that's not the only idea of what schooling should look like. Again, preparing people for careers, preparing people for the workplace, preparing people to, or simply training people in the skills and acquiring and giving them the credentials that they can then leverage in the labor market. Some people would argue that education has deeper implications, that education actually transforms us, that education can actually transform the society. So that text that you're looking at for this week in Teaching to a Democracy comes in that vein. A lot of the people that advocate progressive education, or a lot of the people that advocate Montessori schooling, have this alternative idea of education having intrinsic value, this idea that education gives people a deeper way of being in the world, a broader way of seeing the world and understanding and navigating the world. Um, and so we have these competing models. We have what we would consider a liberal arts model, traditionally a liberal arts model, and all the different forms that can take, and what is more of a traditional vocational model and the varied forms that can take. And I think the question may be more so. I mean, I think it's obviously important to understand the differences between these two ideas, but that unlike at the end of the 19th century, I'm not sure if it's fair for us to consider these as being two extremes, two things that exist on opposite ends of a continuum. That there may be a great deal of synergy. So when I used to teach at community college, a lot of my students were students who were getting degrees in nursing. They were getting their degrees in automotive mechanics. Again, things that would be instrumental in nature in terms of the relationship between their degree and or their schooling rather, and their goals. But at the same time, they were taking sociology classes, they were taking African American studies classes, they were taking classes in the liberal arts tradition. Again, operating from this premise that it's not enough to acquire to acquire education so that one can work, but one has to acquire education so that one can both work and live. And this is the conclusion that Du Bois had come to by the 1930s, that our schooling experience should both prepare us to navigate the structures of society, the economic structures of society, but that our education should also give us a broader perspective, both about the world as well as ourselves. So I'd like for you to think about, these two ideas, and think about it perhaps even within your own educational experience, of this idea of intrinsic and instrumental ends in education. And hopefully we'll have a fruitful discussion about these things on D2L, and ideally we'll have a pretty good face-to-face chat about art in the curriculum. So at any rate, I hope this presentation was helpful, and I'll see you all online and next week soon.